The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, book review. So, I realize that this book is very familiar to a lot of people who will need no introduction to it. At the same time, though, I'm also aware that there are a lot of people out there who maybe have never heard of this book or who are not familiar with it. I think it's quite popular in some circles, maybe depending on who your middle school teacher was, but not well known by everyone everywhere. So, with apologies to people who are already familiar with this book, I'm going to start this video off by giving a general introduction to it for people who are not familiar with it. If you're already familiar with the book, bear with me. Once I get done with the background, I will give my own personal views on this book, or my own personal review of it. So this book was originally published in 1967. What makes this book remarkable is that the author of the book was only 17 when it was published. So this is a case of a young lady who was very literarily gifted from a young age. Now, it's not Shakespeare or anything. It's not incredible prose, but it's decent. It's quite readable. It's much better than anything by a 17-year-old has any right to be. And I think it holds up even to reading from an adult perspective with some limitations. I'll get to my personal review in a moment. Anyways, it was published by Susan Hinton, but the publishers were afraid that if it was published under her real name, male reviewers wouldn't take the book seriously because it had been written by a woman. So they originally published it as S.E. Hinton, and I guess presumably when this book came out for its first round of reviews, nobody actually knew that it had been written by a 17-year-old girl. Nowadays, though, if you pick up a copy of the book or if you look it up on the internet, that's the first thing you find out. The copy I read, it had right on the back cover, first published by 17-year-old Susan Hinton. It's now become a selling point of the book. But yeah, at the time it was written as S.E. Hinton, and she went on to keep that pen name for the rest of her life. She's published several other books since. Once she had originally achieved some fame under those initials, she didn't want to mess with her pen name, so she just kept it as S.E. Hinton since then. Now, the book that she published was written about the rivalry at her high school. So she was still in high school when she wrote the book, and it's based on, the plot of the book is her own creation, but the setting of the book is based on her own experiences in high school. And her own experiences in high school was that there was a violent rivalry between two groups in the high school. One was called the Greasers. And if you're familiar with retro culture, Greasers should be a very familiar term with you, right? Sorry, term for you. Like the John Travolta movie Grease, or, you know, the Greasers, they've got their hair slicked back and they've got the leather jacket. They've got like the ducktail at the back of their hair. You know, the stereotypical kind of 1950s bad boy. So there's the Greasers on the one hand, and then there are the Socias on the other hand. Socias is short for socials, which I guess means socialite. It's the rich kids, essentially. I think nowadays, or at least when I was young, they would have been called preppies. But in S.C. Hinton's high school, they were called Socias. Rich kids who dress nice and wear khakis and a polo sweater and stuff like that. And there was a class difference between these two, as well as a stylistic difference. The Greasers were mostly from poor families. Socias were mostly rich kids. And there was apparently a very violent rivalry between these two groups, which S.E. Hinton wrote about in her book. Now, I'm going to go on a brief digression here to maybe talk about what struck me about the history behind this. Because when I picture 1967, I picture hippies. I picture, psychedelics, rock music. I picture the Vietnam War protests or the Black Power movement, or all of that, comes into my mind when I picture 1967. When I think about greasers, I think about the 1950s. I don't know what other people's impressions are. I mean, that John Travolta movie, Grease, right? It was made during the 1970s, but it was set during the 1950s, right? So that surprised me a little bit. Now, the book, even though it was published in 1967, I believe took place in 1965. That's not clear anywhere on the inside of the book. Like when you're reading the book, nowhere does it identify the year 1965, but other things I've read about the book place it in 1965 for whatever reason. And I guess you figure, if it was published in 1967, I mean, it doesn't get written on the same day it gets published, right? So I guess it's reasonable that she started writing it in 1965. It still surprises me a little bit to talk about greasers in the 1960s. Yeah, apparently this is what was going on. There's a Salon.com article that I've stumbled upon, which I'll link in the description down below, which says basically the 60s was nothing like we thought it was. Up until 1965, the 1960s were essentially the same as the 1950s culturally. And then everything that we associate with the 60s came after 1965. So S.E. Hinton was in high school in Oklahoma. I don't know if being kind of in the middle of America would have been different than being in the more cultural centers in terms of the speed of cultural change. I don't know. But at any rate, apparently this was what was going on at her high school in the mid-60s. She did have a follow-up book to this, which is titled That Was Then, This Is Now, which was published in 1971, I believe. Took place during the later 60s. It's a sequel of sorts. It has some of the same characters from The Outsiders in supporting roles. And apparently, according to that book, it talks about how the rivalry between the Socs and the Greasers has disappeared, has been replaced by the new counterculture movement. I've not actually read that book, the follow-up book. I've just read the description of it in Wikipedia. It seems a bit... I mean, the thing is, when you're reading the book The Outsiders, this rivalry between the Greasers and the Socs seems so consuming. It seems like so toxic and something that, that has gripped the whole town, and it's this ancient enmity that neither of them are going to let go of anytime soon. And then apparently when you get to the That Was Then, This Is Now section book, apparently it's all disappeared. So, maybe it has. Youth culture does change quickly, doesn't it? A few years is maybe all it takes. But I thought that was interesting. It's also interesting to read a book like this that was actually published during the time by somebody who was a young person during that time, and to get like a little bit of a time capsule back into that time, because we living nowadays have a lens of the 1960s, which is something that's been created by the media or something that's been created by history books or something. It's always... Historical memory is always selective. So we have this image of the hippies and the Vietnam War and the Black Power movement. And it's easy to forget maybe that these stories about what was going on in Oklahoma in 1965, about the Socs and the Greasers fighting, would otherwise just completely have been forgotten had not they been preserved in S.E. Hinton's book. So these kind of things are very useful to look back on or to read about, to get some sort of insight into the past. That being said, I myself can sometimes be a little bit guilty of being too captivated by whatever book I'm reading. Because a good book can do that, right? They immerse you in the experience, make you feel like you can visualize everything. And it's sometimes easy to forget that this book is written by just one person, And that one person may or may not actually have their finger on the pulse of what society was really like at the time that they were writing. I was able to find one review of The Outsiders that was contemporary, published in, I think, the New York Times in 1967. And I'll link to a copy of that review down below. But the reviewer at the time expressed skepticism of the realism of the book, because in the book, The Outsiders, the poor kids, the greasers, are usually the victims of the violence from the rich kids, the socias. And this contemporary reviewer said at the time, he said, it seems a little strange to me that the rich kids are going around beating up the poor kids. He said, my memory is that it was the other way around in my neighborhood, where it was the poor kids who were attacking the rich kids. Now, I'm not sure if that's correct or not. I mean, it could be that the reviewers got it wrong, or it could be that the reviewer is affected by his own class biases or whatever. Or it could be that he's right. You know, I guess it's always interesting to have those different perspectives whenever you read something that's before your own time. If anyone is watching this video who was actually alive during the 60s and has any thoughts about this or memories of this, I'd be very interested in your comments or your thoughts about this. But yes, published in 1967, and it thereafter became very popular as assigned reading in middle schools, and sometimes high schools, but I think primarily middle schools or junior high schools, where the literature teacher would read through this with the class. Now, I don't think this was ever on the curriculum anywhere. I think this just happened to depend if your middle school teacher liked the book. It could very easily become assigned reading. It's a little bit strange. I mean, it's no classic, so like you wouldn't read it for its cultural value or its literary value per se, but it has always been a book that I think young people like, or young people have identified with the characters, and the characters themselves are all high school students. And so I think it's been very popular as assigned reading in middle schools just for the sake of getting kids reading, or, you know, having a book that kids will actually read. It's also been, throughout its history, a controversial book. So it's been very popular in middle schools, but it's also on the list of books that are frequently challenged or banned in schools. And again, I'll link to a website down below which talks about this. But apparently parents and principals and different groups have objected to it because it portrays kids from broken homes. It portrays kids using drugs and alcohol. It portrays kids without any good adult role models. And there's violence in the book. So it's been popular in middle schools and also not popular in middle schools, I guess, depending on what town you were from or whatever. I actually never read it in middle school myself. My first exposure to this story was the movie. Now, the movie came out in 1983 and did not do overly well at the time, even though it was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. So it had a very famous director behind it. But it since became popular because it had just about every young person who was going to become famous in the 1980s was in this movie just right before they became famous. I mean, the cast of this movie is really impressive, at least if you remember the 1980s. It's got Tom Cruise, completely before he became famous, Patrick Swayze, Rob Lowe, Matt Dillon, Emilio Estevez, Ralph Macchio, the guy who went on to become the Karate Kid, again before he became famous. And the lead is C. Thomas Howell, who somewhat ironically didn't become nearly as famous as any of his co-stars, but I think still has become decently famous over the years. So I think, and again, this might be something that's interesting to compare perspective on, if anyone wants to put their perspective in the comments. My own personal sense of this movie is that it was not very popular when it was released. And then once people rediscovered it and realized that all these famous actors were in that before they got famous, it did become famous, or a bit of a cult classic, in maybe the late 80s and 90s. But I think at this point, we may be to the point where the generation that has grown up with these actors, or sorry, the young generation that's young now, maybe has no fond memory of these actors, did not grow up with them. So they don't know, for example, who Patrick Swayze or Rob Lowe or Matt Dillon is anymore, because these people are past the peak of their fame. I mean, Tom Cruise is still a household name, but not everybody is still. So all that being said, though, I'm not in touch with the culture very much, because I've been living abroad for close to 20 years now. So if you're back in the States or something, let me know what your perception is about how endearing the popularity of this movie is. Now, the plot in the movie follows the book exactly. This is one of those movies that was very faithful to the adaptation of its source material. There are actually two versions of this movie. In 2005, it got re-released with deleted scenes, I believe an extra 22 minutes of material, called something like The Outsiders, a Complete Novel, or something like that. And if you watch that version, then it's really almost exactly the same as the book. The thing you are missing from the book is the narration, which in the book is all told in the first-person narration from Ponyboy, and you do get a little bit more depth and a little bit more background into some of the personalities of these characters, and maybe a little bit more into their backstory, which isn't in the movie, but none of that's really essential. Or to put it another way, if you've seen the movie, I'm not really sure you need to read the book. You kind of know everything that happens. By the same token, if you are moderately curious about this, but you don't want to actually read the book, you can see the movie and you kind of got everything. Although that being said, the book is a pretty light and simple read. It's a YA book. So, coming back to my own experiences here, I didn't actually read the book in middle school, although I've talked to some friends who have, and they said they really enjoyed it reading in middle school, and they thought, it's a kind of book, there's some violence in it, and there's some deaths in it, and it's the kind of book that can seem really intense to you when you're in middle school. And that's essentially what my friend told me. He said, when I was in middle school and I read this, I thought this was really kind of heavy adult stuff. It certainly does not hold up that way from an adult perspective. And I mean, who knows? Maybe kids these days are all desensitized by all the stuff they see on the internet every day. Or I don't know. But I think at least for a few generations, it had a big impact or big attraction for young people reading it in schools. I actually had to read this book because I was teaching a group of teenagers, and this was assigned reading for them. I was in Cambodia teaching English as a second language, but teaching it to an advanced level of high school students. And this book was part of their curriculum, meaning they had to read it, and because they had to read it, I had to read it. And so that's how I finally came to read this book when I was in my 30s, which is a little bit late to be reading a book like this, but I thought I got some interesting things out of it nonetheless. I was always a little bit skeptical about this book. I thought some parts of it were cheesy, some parts of it seemed to be not very realistic to the part about how I thought teenage boys would actually act. I thought it was all right, but there were some parts of it I thought, okay, this is a little bit silly. But it was very popular with the high school students I was teaching. And that made the book a pleasant experience, because if you've ever taught, well, if you've ever taught anything, but especially I think if you've ever taught teenagers, you know that it can be a struggle to find a book that they like. And if you can find most of the time, I'd be giving them stuff to read, and half the time it was stuff the school curriculum had decided for me and I had no control over it. But most of the time they hated the book, just hated the book, and then they started to resent me for making them read it, even though it had come down to me from the school curriculum. And it just created a very unpleasant atmosphere in the class, to the point where both of us, both me and the students, hated the reading lessons. So to have a book like this that the students actually enjoyed and liked, I thought, oh, thank you. Okay, so now we can have some interesting lessons, and they're not going to resent me for having them read this. And it just made all the difference in the world. And that right there is no doubt the reason why this book has been so popular with middle school teachers throughout the years, even though for all its flaws. Now, I said for all its flaws, but it's actually not bad. The focus of the book shows some discipline. We start off with the outsiders, which, a group of greasers, which consists of the main character, Ponyboy, his two brothers, and then the various friends that are hanging around. It's a small, tight-knit group. I don't remember what it is, about 7 characters or something like that. And we get introduced to all these characters fairly early on. They're reasonably distinct and have individual personalities. They're not deep, but you get enough description of them that they seem like people that you would know or that you could imagine. And then once we're introduced to them, then the focus of the story stays tightly on this group the whole time. And it's a discipline of focus that I think is admirable for a 17-year-old. And maybe that's faint praise, but I just think back to the stuff I was writing at 17 and how I could not keep focused on one coherent plot. This is not bad in that respect. The prose is not bad either. It's not great, but it's very readable. It flows. I'm going to illustrate this by reading a couple of paragraphs that I chose more or less at random, but I think this does illustrate how the book flows. This is from page 71. It says, Buck Merrill was Daly's rodeo partner. He was the one who got Daly the job as a jockey for the Slash. J. Buck raised a few quarter horses and made most of his money on fixed races and a little bootlegging. I was under strict orders from both dairy and soda not to get caught within 10 miles of the place, which was dandy with me. I didn't like Buck Merrill. He was a tall, lanky cowboy with a blonde hair and buck teeth. Or he used to be buck-toothed, before he got the front 2 knocked out in a fight. He was out of it. He dug Hank Williams. How gross can you get? Buck answered the door when we knocked, and a roar of cheap music came with him. The clinking of glasses, loud, rough laughter, and female giggles. And Hank Williams. It scraped on my raw nerves like sandpaper. A can of beer in one hand, Buck glared down at us. What do you want? So quite readable, and I think the author also does an excellent job of the whole story is from the voice of Ponyboy, who's one of the greasers. So she's integrating. It's how do I want to say this? It's written the way a kid might talk, except it's not. It's not written, of course, in the way people actually talk, but it does a good way of kind of incorporating elements of the way a greaser would talk into a more literary style that's actually readable. It's a very good example of first-person narration that's readable as a book, but still integrates some of the features of speech that a greaser would actually use, is what I'm trying to say. So, yeah, what else do I want to say about this book? There were some parts that I thought were a little bit cheesy, and there were... Okay, I'm probably going to get in trouble for this one, or... I don't know. I'm going to throw this out there. So I mentioned before, the book was written by a 17-year-old girl, but the publishers didn't want people to know it was a 17-year-old girl. So they called it S.E. Hinton instead of Susan Hinton. And the reason being they thought that the male reviewers would not take it seriously if they knew it was a 17-year-old girl. I, on the other hand, knew that it was a 17-year-old girl writing this, because nowadays that's the first thing you find out about this book. And as I was reading the book, I constantly thought to myself, that's not the way tough guys would actually act. That's just the way a 17-year-old girl is imagining tough guys would actually act. So, I don't know. I mean, I've turned into exactly the kind of male reviewer jerk that the publishers were worried about, and that why they didn't want to release this under her real name. And I wonder to myself, if I didn't know this was written by a 17-year-old girl, if I thought like S.E. Hinton was a 40-year-old literary man, then maybe I wouldn't have been critical of it. Maybe I would have been. Maybe I would have thought, oh, such insight of what an intelligent man he is. Maybe I'm more critical of it because I know it's a girl. I'm not sure, but there are things that I thought I picked up, and I'm going to pass this on here and maybe get your thoughts on it about what you thought. The narrator, Ponyboy, spends a lot of time talking about the physical attributes of the other people in his gang, and what he likes about the way they look, in a way that I thought was maybe more typical of the female gaze than maybe a male might have picked up on. I'll give you a couple examples here. From pages 12 and 13, he said, "If I had to pick the real character of the gang, it would be Dallas Winston, Dally. I used to like to draw his picture when he was in a dangerous mood, for then I could get his personality down in a few lines. He had an elfish face, with high cheekbones and a pointed chin, small sharp teeth and ears like a lynx. His hair was almost white, it was so blonde, and he didn't like haircuts or hair oil either. So it fell over his forehead in wisps and kicked out in the back in tufts and curled behind his ears and along the nape of his neck. His eyes were blue, blazing ice cold, with a hatred of the whole world." Now, that doesn't strike me as the way maybe one greaser would describe another greaser. The whole premise of this book is that Ponyboy, even though he's a greaser, is actually sensitive and he's actually intelligent. So you do have to give it some space there. But still. And then he also talks a lot about how handsome his brother Soda is. Soda Pop is the nickname. So he said, "Soda is handsomer than anyone else I know. Not like Derry. Soda's movie star kind of handsome. The kind that people stop on the street to watch go by. He's not as tall as Derry, and he's a little slimmer, but he has a finely drawn, sensitive face that somehow manages to be reckless and thoughtful at the same time. He's got dark gold hair that he combs back